Albert Francis, Sonny Capone, was born into the roar of gunfire and the glare of headlines, yet he lived and died in near total silence. The only son of America's most feared gangster, Al Capone, Sonny grew up in a world built on blood, power, and fear. But while his father ruled the streets of Chicago, Sonny's story unfolded in the shadows, a life shaped by secrets, betrayal, and a name too dangerous to speak aloud. His silence hid more than pain, it hid the truth about what really happened to the Capone legacy after the empire fell. In the roaring chaos of the 1920s, when the streets of Chicago were alive with jazz, corruption, and blood, one name stood above all others: Alphonse Gabriel Capone. To the public, he was the smiling king of crime, a man who handed out turkeys to the poor while running the most powerful bootlegging empire in America. To law enforcement, he was a ghost, untouchable and unstoppable. But behind the blinding lights of his criminal fame and the echo of gunfire in the streets, there was a secret that Al Capone guarded more fiercely than his empire. His only son, Albert Francis Capone, known to the world simply as Sonny, was born into a dynasty of fear and fortune. His father's world revolved around control, and yet there was one thing Capone could not control: his son's silence. As a child, Sonny suffered from a severe ear infection that left him partially deaf. The condition isolated him from the chaos that surrounded his family. While his father's men shouted orders and deals in smoke-filled rooms, Sonny sat quietly in the corner, watching lips move but hearing nothing. For Capone, who ruled through sound threats, orders, and gunshots, the silence of his son was a wound that never healed. From the beginning, Sonny's life was different from that of any ordinary child. Private tutors came to teach him reading and writing in secret, while guards stood at every window. His mother, May Capone, protected him from the dark world his father built. But even her love couldn't hide the truth. Their mansion in Miami shimmered with luxury, yet every shadow carried danger. The boy was never allowed to play outside alone. Every car that drove by, every stranger that looked too long, was seen as a potential threat. Despite the isolation, Sonny admired his father. He saw a man adored by his men, respected by the poor, and feared by the police. But as he grew older, he began to sense the weight of his father's name. He saw blood on his father's hands, sometimes literally. He saw the look in his mother's eyes when Capone came home late, his clothes stained and his temper boiling. The lavish parties that filled their home meant nothing to the boy who could not hear the music. To the outside world, Al Capone was a myth, a symbol of the American dream twisted into corruption. But within the walls of his mansion, he was just a father, desperate to keep his son away from the empire he built. Yet destiny had other plans. The name Capone was too powerful to escape, too heavy to forget. Even as a child, Sonny knew that his silence could not protect him forever. The whispers of his father's crimes were everywhere, and they would follow him for the rest of his life. As the years passed and the empire grew, so did the distance between father and son. Al Capone's power reached its peak, but the one thing he longed for most, a normal life for his boy, was the one thing he could never buy. The Roaring Twenties belonged to the mob, to money, and to blood. And at the center of it all stood a child who heard none of it, yet felt everything. The story of Al Capone's son did not begin with a gunshot or a heist. It began with silence, the kind that could drown out even the loudest legend. While the world saw Al Capone as the untouchable ruler of Chicago, his only son, Sonny, grew up in a world carefully hidden behind locked gates and drawn curtains. As his father's empire of bootlegging and racketeering expanded, Sonny's childhood became a strange mix of wealth and imprisonment. The Capone mansion in Miami shimmered with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and expensive cars parked outside. Yet for the young boy, it often felt like a cage. Every door was guarded, every visitor questioned, and every sound outside carried the threat of danger. Sonny's mother, May Capone, devoted herself to shielding him from the world his father built. She filled his days with lessons, books, and quiet routines, far removed from the chaos that defined Al Capone's reign. Private tutors came and went, teaching Sonny to read lips and understand sign language so he could communicate beyond the silence that defined his world. Though he could not hear the music or the laughter at the lavish parties his father threw, he saw the movement of mouths, the rhythm of bodies swaying to the beat, and the faces that smiled through fear. Even as a boy, he could sense when people were pretending. He watched his father's men arrive in polished suits, carrying briefcases that were heavier than money alone. He noticed how they never looked directly at him, as if the boss's son were too fragile for the world they lived in. But Sonny was observant, sharper than anyone realized. He saw the way his father's expression changed after each meeting, how the warmth in his smile vanished the moment business was discussed. He saw the late-night gatherings, the coded gestures, the stains on clothing that his mother would quietly wash away before sunrise. Even without sound, Sonny understood the language of fear. Al Capone loved his son fiercely. He spoiled him with toys, clothes, and anything money could buy. But no amount of gifts could drown out the silence that separated them. The crime boss who commanded thousands of men could not hold a normal conversation with his own child. He would watch Sonny playing alone in the garden, frustration and sadness mixing in his eyes. Capone wanted his son to inherit respect, not violence, but deep down, he knew the Capone name carried a curse that no child could escape. When the newspapers splashed his father's name across their front pages, Sonny's world shrank even more. The neighbors whispered, the teachers stared, and the guards tightened their watch. He was told not to answer questions about his father, not to go anywhere without protection. At night he would watch his mother praying silently, her lips trembling, her eyes wet. He didn't need sound to understand that she was afraid. As the years passed, Sonny became the quiet witness to a crumbling empire. He could not hear the gunshots that echoed through Chicago, but he felt their vibration in the walls of their home. He could not hear the screams of those who crossed his father, but he saw the headlines that followed their disappearances. The world around him spoke in violence, and though he lived apart from it, he was still its prisoner. Sonny grew up knowing two truths, that his father was both loved and hated, and that silence could be the safest weapon of all. While Al Capone's empire thrived on noise, deals, and danger, his son's world was shaped by stillness, secrets, and fear. In the mansion built by crime, the quietest person of all was the one who saw everything. The year 1931 marked the beginning of the end for Al Capone. The empire he built through fear and blood began to crumble under the weight of the law. The same man who once ruled Chicago's streets with unmatched confidence was suddenly trapped, not by rival gangs or bullets, but by numbers on a piece of paper tax evasion. When the verdict came, the city that once trembled at his name watched him fall. For Sonny, it was the moment his quiet world shattered. He was only 12 years old when federal agents raided their homes, seizing everything that carried his father's name. He couldn't hear the shouting, the clatter of boots, or the chaos that surrounded him. But he saw it, the panic on his mother's face, the stern eyes of men in uniform, and the way his father's shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible weight. The invincible man he had once idolized was led away in handcuffs, his head lowered, his eyes avoiding his son's gaze. Sonny was quickly sent away for his own protection. The government, fearing retaliation from Capone's enemies, moved him and his mother to Florida under a new identity. They were told to stay quiet, to disappear, to become ordinary people in a world that hated their last name. In those silent days, Sonny learned what it meant to be alone. His father was locked behind bars, his family name stained, and every door seemed to close before he could even knock. Al Capone was sent first to Atlanta Penitentiary and later to Alcatraz, a place designed to break even the strongest men. From the island prison, Capone wrote letters to his wife and son, sometimes in shaky handwriting, sometimes with tears staining the paper. He told Sonny to stay in school, to stay out of trouble, to be better than him. The man who once ruled with violence was now a shadow of himself, a prisoner clinging to the memory of the boy he could never truly reach. Sonny, meanwhile, tried to live a normal life, but normal was impossible. Every time someone learned who he was, the whispers began. Teachers treated him differently, Neighbors watched him from their windows, and some parents warned their children to stay away. No matter how much he tried to hide, the ghost of Al Capone followed him everywhere. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, and more determined to vanish from the shadow that had shaped his life. When his father's health began to deteriorate, the news spread quickly. Years of prison and untreated illness had taken their toll. By the time Capone was released in 1939, he was no longer the gangster king who once ruled Chicago. He was frail, confused, and broken, a man haunted by his past. For Sonny, the reunion was painful. The father he remembered was gone, replaced by someone who barely recognized him. As he stood beside the man the world once called Scarface, Sonny realized that the empire his father built had cost them everything. The wealth, the power, the fear, it had all turned to dust. All that remained was a name that could never be forgotten, and a son who would spend the rest of his life trying to escape it. When Al Capone was finally released from prison in 1939, the once feared mob boss was a shell of the man who had dominated America's underworld. Years of disease and isolation had left him frail and confused. The man who had once commanded armies of gangsters now struggled to remember names, places, and even moments from his past. When Sonny stood before him, the reunion was heartbreaking. His father's eyes seemed lost, wandering between memory and madness. He could barely speak in full sentences, and at times he thought he was still running his empire, giving orders to men who were long gone. For Sonny, it was as if the father he once knew had died behind prison walls. May Capone tried to create a sense of peace for her husband's final years. The family lived quietly at their mansion in Palm Island, Florida, surrounded by guards and servants who pretended everything was normal. Sonny, now a young man, spent his days caring for his father, watching as his health slowly declined. The once mighty gangster spent his days feeding fish, pacing the gardens, and muttering to himself about lost deals and old friends. It was as if his mind was trapped between two worlds, the violent past he could not escape and the fragile present that barely held him together. For Sonny, it was a time of reflection and sorrow. He loved his father, yet he could not ignore the legacy of destruction that surrounded them. The empire that had once funded their wealth had been built on blood and betrayal. Now, with his father's mind slipping away, all that remained were memories and fear. When Al Capone died in 1947, the newspapers exploded with headlines, each one glorifying the criminal legend. None of them mentioned the son who stood silently by the grave, mourning a man the world celebrated for all the wrong reasons. After the funeral, Sonny disappeared from the spotlight entirely. He changed his name to Albert Francis Brown, choosing to leave behind the identity that had cursed his family. Under his new name, he moved to California, married a woman named Diane, and began a life of quiet normalcy. He worked as an accountant, earning an honest living, something his father had never done. Neighbors knew him as polite, reserved, and distant, unaware that he was the son of one of history's most notorious criminals. But no matter how much he tried to forget, the shadow of his father followed him. Reporters occasionally tracked him down, desperate for a quote or a photograph. But Sonny always refused. He wanted no fame, no interviews, no reminders. The world had already written enough about Al Capone. He wanted his own story to fade into silence. As the years passed, Sonny's name slowly disappeared from public memory. The Capone fortune was gone, and the family scattered. Yet in the quiet corners of his mind, Sonny carried the weight of his father's choices. He had lived his life trying to be the opposite of everything Al Capone represented, peaceful instead of violent, private instead of powerful. Still, the past had left a permanent mark. He had grown up surrounded by luxury and fear, and though he escaped the noise, he could never escape the silence that defined his life. In the early 1960s, long after the Capone name had faded from newspaper headlines, the discovery reignited old whispers. In a dusty Miami warehouse once owned by one of Al Capone's former associates, workers stumbled upon a large steel safe hidden behind a crumbling wall. Inside, buried beneath old ledgers and yellowed documents, was a black leather notebook embossed with the initials AC. It was the kind of find historians dream about, an artifact that could unravel decades of secret. When federal agents opened it, they discovered something extraordinary: lists of bank accounts, coded messages, and names of men who had once served under Capone's empire. Among the accounts was one that sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was registered under the name Albert F. Brown. That name, long hidden from the public, belonged to Sonny Capone. After years of living quietly under his new identity, Sonny was suddenly pulled back into the dark world he had tried to bury. Agents knocked on his door, questioning him about the ledger and the fortune it hinted at. Millions of dollars that had seemingly vanished with his father's downfall. Sonny, now a middle-aged man, claimed to know nothing about it. He insisted that he had built his life from scratch and that any money his father had hidden died with him. But the agents weren't convinced. They believed Capone had entrusted his son with secret instructions before his death. Directions that led to an untapped fortune, perhaps stashed away in offshore accounts or hidden properties. The interrogation reignited the pain Sonny had spent decades suppressing. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into another scandal tied to his father's name. He had spent his entire life avoiding attention, working hard to prove he was nothing like the man who had raised him. But now, headlines once again began to appear. Capone's son questioned in hidden fortune probe. The return of the Capone legacy. Even though he was never charged with anything, the renewed scrutiny shattered the quiet life he had built. Friends and colleagues began to distance themselves. Old acquaintances resurfaced, claiming to have known his father, asking for favors or information. For Sonny, it was as if history had found him again, refusing to let him go. What haunted him most were the unanswered questions. Could the ledger really point to hidden money? Had his father tried to leave him something behind, or was it a trap set by old enemies? The truth was impossible to know. Eventually, the investigation lost momentum. The accounts listed in the ledger were frozen or empty, the names connected to them long dead. The government quietly closed the case, but the damage to Sonny's peace was irreversible. Rumors continued to circulate in the underworld, stories of missing millions, of coded messages in Capone's letters, of a secret vault somewhere in Florida that only his son could unlock. Sonny ignored them all. Still, late at night, he sometimes caught himself wondering whether the fortune existed, and if it did, whether it was meant to bless him or destroy him. For a man who had spent his life running from his father's past, the Black Ledger was a cruel reminder that some shadows never fade. In 1974, after years of trying to live an ordinary life, Sonny Capone's quiet world suddenly collapsed once again. He was living under his adopted name, Albert Francis Brown, working as an accountant in California, and keeping out of the public eye. He rarely spoke about his family history and avoided any mention of Chicago or Miami. But in late spring, he told his wife he needed to travel to Chicago for a few days on personal business. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask. It was supposed to be a short trip, a chance perhaps to find closure, to confront old ghosts, or to settle unfinished matters that had haunted him for decades. But Sonny never returned. Days turned into weeks, and worry turned into panic. His wife contacted the police, reporting him missing. Investigators found his rental car abandoned near the outskirts of the city, in a derelict industrial area that once housed several warehouses owned by men connected to Al Capone. The car was unlocked, the keys still inside, and Sonny's suitcase sat neatly on the back seat. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints other than his own. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the car and vanished into thin air. The discovery that followed only deepened the mystery. Inside one of the old warehouses, police found a single envelope resting on a dusty wooden table. Written on the front were the initials AC in faded ink. Inside there was a small black and white photograph. Young Sonny sitting on his father's lap, smiling, with Al Capone's hand resting proudly on his shoulder. On the back of the photograph was a chilling message scrawled in uneven handwriting. The sins of the father never die. The police investigated every possible lead. Some believed Sonny had been kidnapped by someone seeking the rumored Capone fortune. Others suspected that he had stumbled upon something dangerous, perhaps evidence left behind from his father's time that certain people still wanted hidden. But there was no ransom demand, no calls, no trace of his movements after he arrived in the city. Witnesses near the warehouse district recalled seeing a man matching his description, walking along the riverfront late at night, but no one saw him again after that. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Sonny had been murdered by old associates of his father's empire, men who still carried grudges or unfinished business. Others believed he had faked his own disappearance to escape the constant shadow of the Capone name once and for all. The message on the photograph only fueled speculation. Was it a warning, a threat, or something Sonny had left behind himself, knowing his disappearance would raise questions? Months passed, with no new evidence. The case went cold, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and the haunting photograph as its only clue. His family eventually held a memorial service, though his body was never found. To the world it seemed like the silent son had simply vanished, consumed by the same darkness that had once surrounded his father. For decades afterward, theories continued to circulate. Some claimed Sonny was killed for knowing too much. Others whispered that he had escaped under another name and lived quietly in another part of the country. Whatever the truth, his disappearance marked the final chapter in a family cursed by power, crime, and secrecy. It was as if the Capone legacy had swallowed him whole, proof that even silence could not protect him from the ghosts of his past. More than 2 decades after Sonny Capone's mysterious disappearance, the past returned in the most unexpected way. In 1998, a construction crew working near the banks of the Chicago River uncovered a rusted metal box, buried beneath layers of concrete and soil. At first the workers assumed it was nothing more than discarded scrap from the city's old industrial days. But when the box was pried open, they found a collection of items carefully wrapped in oilcloth, photographs, handwritten notes, and several envelopes sealed with wax. Among them was a stack of letters signed by one name that made every investigator stop in disbelief: Al Capone. The letters appeared to have been written during Capone's final years in Florida. After his release from prison, many were rambling and disjointed, reflecting the mental decline caused by his illness. But one stood out. It was addressed to my son, written in shaky handwriting, but surprisingly clear. In it, Capone spoke of regret, fear, and unfinished business. He admitted that he had hidden money through trusted men and secret accounts before his arrest, an insurance deal, as he called it, meant to protect his family in case the empire fell. He warned Sonny not to trust anyone from his old circle, claiming some of them had betrayed him and might come for what was left. The letter ended with a cryptic line: "When the time is right, you'll know where to look. The river remembers everything." News of the discovery spread fast. The FBI reopened the Capone family file, hoping the letter might reveal clues about the rumored hidden fortune that had haunted investigators for decades. The documents were analyzed, authenticated, and confirmed to be genuine. Yet one question overshadowed everything. If this letter had truly been meant for Sonny, had he found it before he vanished? Or had someone else found it first? Speculation ran wild. Some experts believed the letter proved that Sonny had returned to Chicago in 1974 searching for his father's secret cache of money. Others suggested he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous, evidence tying living men to crimes from the old days. The message written on the back of the photograph, found at his disappearance, "The sins of the father never die," now seemed to carry a deeper meaning, as though sound had been warning him to stop digging into what was meant to stay buried. The FBI traced several of the bank account numbers listed in the old ledger found years earlier, connecting them to offshore accounts in the Caribbean. Most were empty, but small transactions had occurred as recently as the 1970s. The same decade Sonny disappeared. The timing was too precise to ignore. It suggested that someone, perhaps not Sonny himself, had accessed the funds after Capone's death. Whether it was family, former associates, or someone who intercepted the hidden instructions, no one could say. Historians debated endlessly over the meaning of Capone's final words. Was the river, mentioned in his letter, a metaphor or a clue to something tangible hidden near the Chicago River, the very spot where the box had been found? Theories flourished, and treasure hunters descended on the area, digging in hopes of finding Capone's legendary missing millions. Nothing of value was ever discovered, but the letter reignited a mystery that refused to die. By the time the investigation closed, the only certainty left was that Al Capone had left behind more than money. He had left a curse, a legacy that swallowed his son and outlived his entire bloodline. The unearthed letter proved that the past still whispered beneath the city streets, and that somewhere, hidden in the silence between truth and myth, lay the real fate of the silent son. In 2004, nearly 70 years after Al Capone's death, the world was once again drawn into the mystery surrounding his lost heir. A man came forward claiming to be the grandson of Al Capone's only son, Albert Francis Capone, known to most as Sonny. He presented DNA evidence linking his family to the Capone bloodline, reigniting a story many believed had ended decades ago. What he revealed next stunned historians, journalists, and investigators alike. According to him, his grandfather had not disappeared in 1974 as everyone believed. Instead, he had lived under a new identity in California until his quiet death in 1994. If true, this meant that Sonny had outlived almost everyone connected to his father's empire, choosing a life of total secrecy far from the shadow of Chicago's underworld. The grandson described a man who rarely spoke about his past, who kept old photographs locked in a box and refused forged crime documentaries or read newspapers that mentioned the Capone name. He had lived modestly in a small house surrounded by fruit trees, spending most of his time gardening and writing in notebooks that no one was allowed to read. To his neighbors, he was a kind but distant man, polite, punctual, and private. None of them knew that the quiet elderly gentleman who kept to himself was the son of one of the most feared gangsters in American history. When he died, he left behind very little. No large estate, no hidden fortune, no evidence of the legendary millions that had vanished with his father's empire. Yet among his belongings, there was a small metal box, similar to the one unearthed by the Chicago River years earlier. Inside were a few family photographs, a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials AC, and a handwritten note that read simply, "Let the past stay buried." Whether this was meant as a warning or an expression of peace, no one could tell. But to those who knew the Capone legend, it felt like a final message from the silent son himself, a plea to end the endless search for a truth that had already destroyed so much. After his death, stories continued to circulate. Some said Sonny had indeed known where his father's fortune was hidden, but chose never to claim it, fearing it would only bring danger. Others believed he had destroyed all evidence of it, erasing every trace of his father's criminal past to protect his descendants. Whatever the truth, Sonny's life seemed defined by one decision: to live quietly in a world that could never forget his name. Historians who studied his story often described it as a tragedy wrapped in silence. Al Capone's empire had been built on noise, gunfire, deals, and headlines, but his son's life was lived in whispers, behind closed doors, under false names. Even in death, Sonny remained an enigma, leaving behind more questions than answers. The mystery of the missing fortune was never solved. No hidden vault was ever found, no secret account ever uncovered. Yet perhaps the real treasure was something else entirely: the peace Sonny fought so hard to protect. In the end, he succeeded in living a life his father never could, quiet, unseen, and free from violence. But the legend of the Capones refused to fade. Books, documentaries, and films continued to resurrect their story, always returning to the haunting question: what truly happened to the silent son? Some believe his silence was a shield, others think it was a burden he carried until the end. Whatever the truth, the final legacy of Al Capone's only child is not one of crime or wealth, but of a man who chose to vanish rather than become the echo of his father's sins. His story remains a chilling reminder that even the loudest legacies can end in silence.